Okay, so in this Final Cut Pro 10 tutorial, I'm going to run through how to import, edit, and export a Final Cut Pro video. And we're going to run through those steps relatively quickly, but we'll give a few tips and tricks along the way. We'll look at how we bring things down to the timeline and also look at a bit of project management. So the first thing that you'll see when you open up Final Cut Pro is this type of layout. So before we bring any footage in, we're going to have a quick whistle-stop tour of the Final Cut Pro 10 interface. So on the left-hand side here, we have the library, and this is really where we set up our project. So for every project in Final Cut Pro, creating separate libraries for each individual project that you're working on makes things a little easier to manage, okay? Within that library, you can have different timelines, but basically for each edit, you want to have a different library. Then across here towards the right, we have the browser, which is where when we import footage, we'll be able to view a list of our footage, view the thumbnails of our footage, and we'll have a look at that in a sec. Across here on the right-hand side, we have the viewer, and this is really where we see our final edit. So when we're playing back our final edit, we'll see that edit in the viewer, and the viewer is interchangeable with the timeline down here, or the project window, which we'll see. We also have a couple of other windows which aren't visible at the moment, okay? And those are importantly the inspector. So if you go to Windows, Show Inspector, this is where we manage things like the cropping of a video, the position or scale of a video when we have it selected and placed on our timeline. We also have down towards the right some other panels such as the Effects panel and the Transitions panel, which are the two panels across here on the right hand side that you'll come to first. So the effects, for adding effects to video, for making something grayscale, for making something look like an aged film effect, the transitions, for your crossfades, for your white between your clips, and then also your text for your lower thirds and any text titles that you want to place in Final Cut Pro. Those are the main three that you'll need to use. We have some tools across here on the left hand side, and then importantly our time code in here in the middle. So the first thing we're going to go ahead and do before we bring in some footage is create a new library in Final Cut Pro. So if you go to File, New, and Library, then once we're in here, we get the opportunity to give a name for our library. And when we're looking at our desktop, the library is where all our files will be saved in Final Cut Pro unless we change some preferences for managing files in a different way. So let's call this Intro to Final Cut Pro. Okay, that's the name of my library, and that's the folder we'll see, or the file we'll see on the desktop. Okay, so we'll click Save for that. And now once we have a library, you can see we have Smart Collections across here on the left, and we also have a dated folder, which is an event within our library. Okay, so we can make multiple events within our library for managing media in different ways. Okay, so what we're going to do now is go to import files in a couple of different ways. Okay, so I'm going to jump down to the desktop, the Finder, first of all. I've got some footage in my desktop, and if you can see your QuickTime movies from your camera, from your DSLR, then you can drag them across straight into Final Cut Pro. So if I drag a movie here, then I can drag it straight across. It will import it. And if we have our preferences set up in Final Cut Pro, it'll make a copy of that into the library. I've changed my preferences, and this is kind of an important point. So if I go to Final Cut Pro Preferences, I've changed my preferences to leave the files in place. And what this does is it saves a little bit of hard drive space. The default is to copy your files to the library. So it's using the library that we just created as a storage location. By leaving them in place, we're not doubling up our footage, okay? If you're importing from an SD card or from a camera, then you will be copying or need to copy your files to the storage location. But if you have a different setup for managing your videos, your audio, your images, then leave in place is a fine option, okay? So let's close this window now. We'll come back to the preferences a little bit later to talk about some different things. Now we have a video in Final Cut Pro, and you can see as I move across, I'm scrubbing across the video, okay? You can turn the scrubbing on and off. It's this little blue button down here in this section just below my viewer, okay? So I can toggle that on and off, okay? S is the shortcut for that, and that allows me to turn off or on the scrubbing. Scrubbing is useful here to be able to view what's inside your clip, okay? So we can view what's inside the whole clip, okay? We can also zoom in and out of our clip, so we can see either a thumbnail of our clip, which is what we see now, or we can zoom in and it will show us the clip with a film strip of the different sections of that clip. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the second way of importing. So if we go to File and Import Media, this is the way we would bring media in from our camera, and we can bring media in from the desktop as well. So if you go to Media, you'll see the devices listed on the left-hand side here. We can import directly from the FaceTime camera. So if you're doing video blogs or vlogs, then you can record straight into Final Cut Pro using this feature here, okay? We are going to jump to the desktop, okay? Now, when we're navigating within Final Cut Pro here, we only see a list of the devices connected, and then also the favorites that we've saved. So as I'm navigating through my folders here, you have to, in the first instance, go to your users folder, to your desktop, and then we can navigate into the desktop there to find data, or as I've done, we can drag a link across to our favorites here. Okay, so you can drag a link to your desktop, to your other documents or movie folders if you want to, and that will mean it shows up instantly for you here. So for instance, on my desktop, I've got this Sugarbush folder, which is where some of my media is stored. If I drag that to the favorites, it makes a new link to that favorites folder. I can jump to it very quickly. Okay, so if you have a hard drive that you're importing from regularly, then you can add it into your favorites here. So now if we select a video, okay, the same video, let's just move to a slightly different one. We can preview it here, we can screen it within Final Cut Pro, and we can also mark in and out points to import. Okay, or we can select the whole clip and import that whole clip. Okay, if we now grab a few clips here, in fact we'll grab them all, we can import the selected files. We've got the options here again to copy files to our library, so you can make that decision here, leave the files in place, and these options for optimizing or creating proxy media will basically make a second version of your file, and particularly on a laptop or older computer when you're working with Final Cut Pro 10, working with proxy media is a really useful thing to do, and you can check out my video on that online as well. Okay, so we'll leave the keywords video and audio analysis, and we'll go ahead and import selected, and that will now import our files into Final Cut Pro 10. And I'm zoomed in my browser here, so I'm going to zoom right out, and you'll see that we have this thumbnail list of the different videos we just imported. Now we can change the view in our browser here. Okay, so we can change it from film strip view or thumbnail view to list view, which means that when we click on a clip, we see a list of the videos or images, audio files, and we can navigate them as a list. Okay, so we see the file name a little larger. Okay, the scrubbing works the same. We can still screen the clips here, and it really depends on how you like to work as to whether you want to use the film strip view or the list view. Okay, if we highlight a clip, okay, we've got our inspector up here on the right, which you can bring up from the window menu if you don't have it up. And in there we can see the info of our footage. Okay, now if your footage is looking like it's a little bit lower quality, or you want to know things like the frame rate of your footage, then this is the place to come before you start to work on your edit. Okay, so we can see the resolution of this clip, and we can also see the duration of the clip as well. So the media start, the media end, and the media duration. Okay, so if we go back to the video, you can see there's a list of effects that we can add there, but really I don't add any effects to my clips when I'm working on them in the browser or reviewing them in the browser. I normally will do that once I've got them down into my project timeline. Okay, so I refer to a library as a project because that's where I like to keep one project with the different edits associated with that one project, but actually Final Cut Pro calls the timeline your project. Okay, so there's a little bit of a strange thing going on with the naming. So we're going to click on New Project here. Okay, and this is going to be our first edit. Now, if you're setting up a project and you want to control the resolution of your edit, then you need to change this video property. So set based on first clip will set the timeline based on the properties of the first clip. So all my clips here are 1920 by 1080, so HD quality. But if I happen to drop an SD quality piece of footage onto my timeline, then my timeline will be based upon that size. So it would use the resolution and the frame rate from that video. So sometimes it's worth just familiarizing yourself with the footage and its format as it comes in, and then customizing your format. So I've got the format set up at the format, the resolution, and the frame rate that I use for all my video cameras. So I know that when I'm editing from those different cameras, whether it's my DSLR or my video camera, that I'm going to get the same quality footage. So under audio channels, this you can use the default settings. Once we've got this all set up, we can click OK. Now, one thing about Final Cut Pro is it's always saving your project in the background. So if we right click here and close this library, it's already saved. We don't need to go to File, Save, as we do in other applications to kind of save it off. So basically it's doing a kind of live save. So every edit you do, everything you change in Final Cut Pro 10 is being saved as you move along, which is really handy if you have a crash of your computer or something like that. It's very rare that with Final Cut Pro that I've lost any edits, even if something crashes. Okay, so I can close this library. Okay, and then if I go to Open Library, it's going to show a list of the previous libraries that I've been working on. So I'm going to click Choose. Okay, and now you can see in the browser, we have a list of the projects we have working on or our timelines, and then a list of the clips that we're editing. Okay, I can change the name of this event by clicking on it twice, and I'm just going to type in, okay, a new name for that. And you can see that this now is listed here under a new event. Okay, it's not changing here because I'm viewing things by name and by date, but I can change the way that I group my clips. So you can see it's grouped by the date that content was created. So these were 25th of February 2013. But I can also group them by none, or I can group them by things like the duration, the file type, which is often useful. So it will keep my QuickTime movies separate from my images and my audio files, which I find handy. So let's have a look at how we edit some of these clips down to the timeline. So a very basic level, if we hold a clip there without making any selections, we can drag it down to our timeline, and we can keep doing that. Okay, so it's a very simple edit. If you know the clips that you want to bring down to your timeline, then you can go straight away and get those clips down in your timeline. Now it's quick to modify the order of the clips. So I'm just going to grab a couple of clips. So we've got some different ones down on the timeline. Okay, so just editing in a tiny bit of variation here. So basically we have these 3 clips down the timeline. Okay, if we click and hold on one, we can drag the order of it. We can shuffle those clips like a deck of cards. And you can see when I'm doing that, it's not changing the duration of my timeline. Okay, so up here in the timecode bar, you can see the time code. So 30 seconds, 45 seconds, and a minute. Okay, and we can also see the time code up here as we move along our timeline. So how do we shorten these clips? So with the selection tool on, okay, and there are other tools underneath this menu too, but the selection tool will do a lot of the editing for you. We can click and drag clips. Okay, so we can drag in the ends of each clip to shorten them off. Okay, if we want to split a clip, we can use the blade tool. Okay, and that will allow us to split a clip, jump back to the select tool, and then we can reshuffle those clips. Okay, we can also delete sections of a clip or sections of the timeline. Now, one of the sets of keyboard shortcuts that I like to use when I'm editing are J, K, and L, and I and O. And if I press L, it will begin to play through my timeline. Okay, if I tap L a couple of times, it will fast forward me through my timeline. Okay, and then if I stop and press the I key, it will mark an in point. And then if I play through again, I can mark an out point here, and I can use delete or backspace on the keyboard to delete a clip. Okay, and you can see my timeline squishes when I use the backwards delete or backspace button to delete a clip. I can also make that out point across a couple of clips. So if I make that range selection, you can see now in my timeline I'm deleting sections from those 2 different clips. So if I press delete or backspace, okay, it's deleting both those clips. If I want to remove elements from the timeline but I don't want to change the timing of clips that are ahead in time, I can do 2 things. I can do delete, okay, which is forward delete. So if you've got a full keyboard, it's the delete button underneath F14. Okay, if you look at the function keys under F14, there's the forward delete key. Or if I'm working on a laptop, I can use the function key, which is the little tiny FN key at the very bottom left of your laptop. I can use the function key and delete, and that will delete and it will leave this slug in place, which means that I can then replace that with another clip or another edit. Okay, so let's just take another step back here. So if we bring that clip back in and we have another look at the example of using the forward delete or function and delete key, then if we have an attached clip, so I've just dragged a clip up here which works as a layer above my other clip. If I want to delete this clip without moving this clip above, then if I press the delete key or forward delete key below F14, then it allows me to delete that but leaves that connected clip in place, which is an often asked question about Final Cut Pro 10, which is how do you delete clips on the bottom layer without deleting clips on the topmost layer. Okay, so let's have a look a little bit more at navigating the timeline. So we've had a look at how we can drop clips down, but how do we look at our timeline in more detail? So zooming in and zooming out. So we can use the slider on the side here to zoom in and zoom out of our clips, okay, by dragging it to the right to zoom in and by dragging it to the left to zoom out. Personally, I prefer to use some of the shortcut keys. So if you hold down the command key and press plus or minus, it will zoom in or out, okay. If you use shift and tap Z, it will zoom you to your whole timeline. Okay, so if we then select a clip and then zoom in, it's going to zoom in on that selected clip. Okay, let's do shift and Z again to zoom to our whole timeline. So we've had a look at how we shuffle clips, how we zoom in and out of the timeline. We can also change the size of our timeline as well if we want to see a bit more information, particularly if you're working with something with a dialogue, which we're not at the moment. and you want to see the audio a bit more clearly, if we click on this small button here, we can change the clip appearance on the timeline. So we can have all of our audio timeline showing, a larger section for our audio, and we can also adjust the clip height as well. So this means that when we zoom in, we'll see more of that audio waveform. Okay, to see this a bit more clearly, let's just bring a clip with a bit more audio in it so we can see the audio waveform. So I'm going to Shift and Z there to zoom out, and I'll just place my playhead on the timeline there, and I'm going to jump to the Finder, okay, and I'm going to bring in a clip from this folder. So I'll just drag this in, let it drop onto the timeline, and that's another way that you can import directly to the timeline. So if you have clips or images that you want to bring in, then you can drag them straight down to your timeline. And you can see here, by increasing our clip height, we're seeing more of the audio detail, and then as we zoom in, we're going to see even more of that detail. Now, one thing that's happening here is this orange bar across the top is indicating that Final Cut Pro 10 is rendering out my footage. Okay, so at the moment my clip is 13% rendered. If I click on this percentage number here, and we can see that it's rendering in the background. Now, Final Cut Pro will only do this when you're not editing. So as soon as I place my playhead on the timeline, you can see that my render pauses. Okay, so if I stop to think about my next edit, then it will begin to background render again, okay, which is nice because it means you can keep rendering, keep adding effects without rendering while you're performing those functions. Okay, the render files are saved to the library folder, so basically it's going to make your library folder bigger as you add more effects, as you add more transitions. Okay, so let's close that window, and if we have a look at this library, we're just going to right click here and go to Reveal in Finder. This is going to show us our library on the desktop. Okay, so now you can see my Final Cut Pro library at the moment is 266 megabytes, not too big, but these files can become quite big quite quickly. Okay, and one of the reasons for that is the render files. So if we right click into here and show the package contents, you can see that I have some system files, I have my Sugarbush folder, and then in here I have my Final Cut Pro event and edits, okay, and then also my render files. And in here I'm getting some render files for the high quality media, so for the video I've brought in, and I would also have renders for effects in there as well. So that can quite quickly send a short edit in Final Cut Pro into the range of being, you know, several gigabytes in size. Okay, so looking at this clip now, while we're thinking about the audio, we'll just mention a couple things here. So one item that we're not seeing at the moment is the audio levels. Okay, so if we go to Window and show audio meters, we can see our audio meters across on the right hand side here, and if we hit play, we'll get an indication of whether our audio is peaking or not. Okay, and if it peaks, you could get some distortion when you output that file. So you want to watch out for these two boxes at the top right here, and if they go red, we'll just make this happen by adjusting the audio levels. Okay, then that means that your audio has peaked out. Okay, and as you saw, when you want to moderate your audio levels quickly, we can simply drag down this slider. So I've moderated that by -4, -5 decibels, and I've increased it by 5 decibels to get the audio to peak out, which you can see by these red peaks on the timeline here as well. Okay, so we've added clips, we've looked at the technical side of editing here. Let's add a title, a couple transitions, some quick effects, and then we'll export out. So we'll run through these quite quickly. So if we go to our titles window here, we're going to add in some basic titles. Okay, so we're going to add in some basic titles here. We'll scroll down and add in this centered title. Okay, I'll just drag this over the top of my first clip. I can drag titles so they sit over the top of an edit, or onto the main timeline, or the main storyline as it's called itself. Okay, so you can do both those options. I like to have some video behind my title, so what I'll often do is with my video, I will select that clip, go to my video options here, and this is where you can change the size, the crop, the distortion of your video, but also where we can drop the opacity. So if I drop the opacity of this video, because it's the only video on the timeline, it's just going to darken it behind this title. Okay, so I can drag out my title, click on it, okay, and then to edit it, the easiest way is just to double click on the type in the viewer here and type in the title and the subtitle if you need it. And then you have your titles. Okay, we have other options for our titles as well in terms of the fonts we're using in our inspector on the right here. So your inspector will have a lot of important features that you need to control, okay, such as the style of the type. So we've got some 2D styles, we've got some 3D styles, and we would simply select these to add them. So carved wood, for instance, would change the style of that, and we'd need to edit our line size and a couple other things. But you can see here, you can adjust those styles, and you can also adjust them manually by editing the font face, the font color, with these options down here. So the inspector is really useful for editing either the size, the opacity of your video, or the text and the style of a title. So let's go ahead and look now at transition. So we're kind of moving back along here. So the basic transition that you will need a lot of the time is a cross dissolve. Okay, so if I come to all my transitions up here, I'll see my cross dissolve, and that will basically, if I drag this onto my timeline, it will add a cross dissolve. Now, this error is showing up for a particular reason, and that is because we need an overlap between these two videos in order to add a cross dissolve. And if we click create transition here, then you can see my timeline jumped somewhat. So I'll just take a step back and add it again. So if I add this transition, it's going to throw up this window that's warning me that it's going to adjust or ripple the timeline. And you'll see now when I click create transition, it jumps the timeline a little bit. So it's basically making those clips overlap one another. If we shorten the clips ourselves using the selection tool, so basically ripple edit these, then we won't get that error. So if we've edited our clips and we're adding a cross dissolve, then basically that cross dissolve will happen without that second window popping up. And you can see we're getting a preview of the cross dissolve here now because this is still orange, it hasn't rendered yet. So if I move away from the timeline, my cross dissolves will be quickly rendered out, and they'll play a little more smoothly once they're rendered as well. Okay, so let's press play. We can also change the length of our cross dissolves here, okay, and it will ask us to render it again. So now the duration of my cross dissolve here, I can see if I right click and go to change duration, we'll see that I have a 5-second cross dissolve, so a long cross dissolve between those two clips, and the jumpiness is because it hasn't rendered out yet. Okay, and then the last option we'll add here is the effects. So you can see you have a number of different effects: aged film, aged paper, we've got basic effects, we've got specific color effects. So for color correction, this is where you would come in Final Cut Pro. We've got colorized and a number of other different ones. So let's add the colorized filter to this second clip, okay, and you can see if I highlight the clip again in my inspector up here on the right, this is where I can change the options for that colorized filter. So I'm remapping the black here to a certain color, so I can pick a different color, and I'm remapping the white here to a certain color, so I can change that color too. Okay, and then I've got the level of intensity of the remapping, so I can add a little bit of colorization or a lot of colorization to the point where it becomes almost like a screen printed style. Okay, we can turn effects on and off by clicking on this button here. That will turn the effect on and off without removing it. Or if we want to actually delete the effect, we can highlight it and then press delete, and that will remove that effect. Let's take a step back here. So we've added text, we've added effects, we've added transitions by dragging them on, and we've also looked at how we can modify the timeline. Some of the really important things I think I've mentioned here are the J, K, and L keys for navigating the timeline. So playing backwards using the J key, pressing K to pause your clip, and pressing L to play forwards. Okay, and then I and O to mark out an area of the clip that you might then want to delete. Okay, and you can see I deleted the transition there because I deleted this edit point. If we want to remove a selection, we can just click away from the timeline. And now the next step is to share this or export it. Now, if I'm uploading to YouTube, I normally prefer to use the YouTube web browser uploader. It seems to work a lot better. So normally when I'm sharing, I will share my footage as a master file. It means I've got a backup of a full quality version of this file, okay? And in my export window, I'll be just changing the settings to make sure that my video codec is H.264, not Apple ProRes, okay? Apple ProRes won't work when you upload it to YouTube. Okay, so we've got H.264 here. We'll go to next, and we'll save this as first edit export 1080p. I like to put the 1080p in there just so that I can quickly, when I'm viewing the files, actually see what resolution those files are. And now As long as I'm not touching Final Cut Pro, my video will export out. So I've got 35 seconds of editing there to export out. Then it'll be ready as a file on the desktop to upload to YouTube or share somewhere else online. There are export options in here as well for creating a DVD. The DVD functionality is not the best in Final Cut Pro 10. It works really well in Roxio Toast. So if you want to make a DVD with chapters, make all your chapters in Final Cut Pro 10, but then export out a master file and bring that QuickTime file into Roxio Toast where you can create menus. Or if you're lucky enough and you've got DVD Studio Pro, then you can also create professional DVDs in DVD Studio Pro as well. Okay, so that's the end of this Final Cut Pro 10 quick intro. We've covered how to add titles, how to edit on the timeline, how to move clips around the timeline, and also how to add transitions, which are the essential tools that you'll need to actually get going with Final Cut Pro 10. If you have any questions about Final Cut Pro 10, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me online. I save up all the questions and then eventually they feed back into my next tutorials that I'm creating. So I really like that community involvement in the creation of my tutorial content. And I look forward to seeing you on the next tutorial.